Marcus Johnson had always dreamed of owning a home, a place where he could finally breathe easy and let his guard down. And when he closed on a modest 2-story house in Willow Creek Estates, he felt a sense of accomplishment that was almost overwhelming. The neighborhood was quiet, the lawns were manicured, and the streets curved gently between rows of pastel-colored homes, each with its own driveway and a mailbox that gleamed in the sun. For the first few weeks, Marcus reveled in the peace, spending his evenings unpacking boxes, assembling furniture, and planting the small vegetable garden he'd always wanted. He met a few neighbors, mostly polite, reserved, and quick to wave but slow to linger in conversation, and he thought, perhaps, that this was the start of something good. But the tranquility was short-lived. It began innocuously enough. One Monday morning, Marcus stepped outside, coffee in hand, to find a silver Lexus parked squarely in his driveway. At first, he assumed it was a mistake, a delivery driver, maybe, or a friend of a neighbor who'd gotten confused. He waited, expecting someone to come and move the car, but as the hours ticked by and the sun climbed higher, the Lexus remained. By noon, Marcus needed to leave for work, and after knocking on a few doors with no luck, he called a number listed on the HOA welcome packet he'd received when he moved in. The woman who answered introduced herself as Karen, the HOA president, and when Marcus explained the situation, she laughed lightly and said, "Oh, that's my car. I had a meeting down the street, and your driveway was empty. I'll move in a bit." She didn't sound apologetic, and when she finally arrived an hour later, with a clipboard in hand and a brisk, businesslike air, she simply got her car and drove away without so much as a word of thanks or regret. Marcus shrugged it off, figuring it was a one-time thing, but over the next few weeks, the pattern repeated itself. Karen's Lexus would appear in his driveway at least once or twice a week, sometimes for an hour, sometimes for the whole day. Each time, Marcus would call, and each time, Karen would act as if he were being unreasonable. "It's just a driveway," she'd say. "You weren't even home." Marcus tried to be patient. He left polite notes on her windshield, asking her not to park there. He spoke to her in person, explaining that he needed access to his driveway at all times, but Karen just smiled and waved him off. "This is a community," she said. "We share." The situation escalated when Marcus came home late one evening to find Karen's car not only in his driveway, but blocking his garage. He sat in his car, engine idling, waiting for her to return. When she finally did, she rolled her eyes and said, "You really need to relax. It's not a big deal." Marcus clenched his fists, struggling to keep his voice calm. "Sherry means asking first," he said. Karen laughed. "You'll get used to it." The next day, Marcus attended his first HOA meeting, hoping to address the issue in a more formal setting. The community center was packed with neighbors, most of them older, all of them white, and Karen sat at the front, presiding over the meeting with her usual air of authority. When Marcus brought the parking issue, Karen smiled tightly and said, "There's no rule against it. The HOA guidelines say driveways are part of the community's shared space." A murmur ran through the room, but no one spoke up in his defense. "I bought my house. My driveway is on my property," Marcus insisted, but Karen just shrugged. "If you have a problem, take it up with the city." The meeting moved on, and Marcus sat down, feeling invisible. The next morning, he found a violation notice taped to his door. His grass was half an inch too long. His trash bin was visible from the street. His mailbox was the wrong shade of black. He looked across the street and saw Karen's lawn was a jungle, her trash bins overflowing, but there was no violation notice in sight. That night, Marcus called his sister, Tasha, and told her everything. "You need to stand up for yourself," she said. "People like her only stop when you make them." Marcus hesitated. "I don't want to start a war." Tasha's voice was firm. "You didn't start it. She did." That weekend, Marcus sat at his kitchen table, surrounded by stacks of HOA bylaws and city ordinances, determined to find a solution. He discovered that, contrary to Karen's claim, driveways were private property and unauthorized vehicles could be towed at the owner's expense. He called the city to confirm, then found a local towing company willing to help. The next time Karen parked in his driveway, Marcus didn't call her. He called the tow truck. He watched from his window as the driver hooked up the Lexus and hauled it away. Karen arrived an hour later, fuming. "Where's my car?" she demanded. "Towed," Marcus said, holding up a copy of the city ordinance. "Private property." She screamed at him, threatened to call the police, the HOA, her lawyer. Marcus stood his ground. "Next time, don't park in my driveway," he said, and closed the door, heart pounding but feeling, for the first time since he'd moved in, that he truly belonged. The aftermath of the towing incident rippled through Willow Creek Estates like a stone dropped in a still pond, and Marcus quickly realized that standing up for himself was only the beginning of a much larger battle. The very next morning, he awoke to find a flurry of emails from the HOA in his inbox, each more officious than the last, all signed by Karen. The subject lines ranged from urgent, violation of community spirit, to immediate action required, hostile behavior, and the body of each message was a masterclass in passive-aggressive rhetoric. Karen accused Marcus of creating an atmosphere of hostility, undermining the values of Willow Creek, and failing to resolve neighborly disputes in a civil manner. She CC'd the entire HOA board, and by noon, Marcus had received a handful of terse, vaguely threatening phone calls from other board members, most of whom he'd never met. He responded to each message with calm, factual replies, attaching copies of city ordinance and the relevant sections of the HOA bylaws, but it was clear that Karen was determined to make his life as difficult as possible. That afternoon, as Marcus was mowing his lawn, making sure to keep the grass exactly 2 inches high, as specified in the HOA guidelines, he noticed Karen standing at the edge of her property, arms folded, watching him with a look of pure disdain. She didn't say a word, but her presence was a silent accusation, a reminder that she was always watching. Over the next week, the harassment escalated. Marcus received 3 more violation notices. One for a garden hose left coiled on the side of his house, another for a non-regulation welcome mat, and a third for excessive noise after he played music at a perfectly reasonable volume on a Saturday afternoon. Each notice was accompanied by a fine, and each fine was accompanied by a letter from Karen, dripping with condescension. Marcus paid the fines, not wanting to give Karen any more ammunition, but he kept meticulous records of every interaction, every notice, every payment. He started to notice other things, too. Neighbors who used to wave now averted their eyes, conversations that stopped when he approached, a general sense of unease that seemed to follow him wherever he went. It was as if Karen's campaign against him had cast a shadow over his entire life, and for the first time since moving in, Marcus wondered if he'd made a terrible mistake. But then, something unexpected happened. One evening, as Marcus was watering his fledgling tomato plants, a woman from down the street approached him. She introduced herself as Mrs. Patel, and after a few minutes of small talk, she leaned in and whispered, "You did the right thing, you know. Karen's been bullying people here for years. Most of us are just too scared to stand up to her." Marcus was stunned. He'd assumed he was alone, but as the days passed, more neighbors began to reach out, some with words of encouragement, others with their own stories of Karen's overreach. There was Mr. Lee, who'd been fined for having a flagpole in his yard, the Garcias, who'd been threatened with legal action over a playset for their kids, and then Gwynn's, who'd received a violation notice for unauthorized holiday decorations. Each story was a variation on the same theme. Karen using her position as HOA president to enforce her own arbitrary rules, targeting anyone who didn't fit her narrow vision of what Willow Creek should be. Emboldened by this newfound sense of solidarity, Marcus decided to take action. He started attending every HOA meeting, taking careful notes and asking pointed questions. He requested copies of the HOA's financial records, which Karen was legally required to provide but had always kept closely guarded. He encouraged his neighbors to do the same, and soon a small but determined group began to form, a coalition of residents who were tired of Karen's reign of terror. At the next meeting, Marcus stood up and read aloud from the city ordinance, making it clear that driveways were private property and that any future violations would be met with the same response. He presented a petition, signed by 24 residents, demanding greater transparency and accountability from the HOA board. Karen tried to dismiss him, but the tide was turning. For the first time, other board members began to question her decisions, to push back against her arbitrary fines and selective enforcement. The meeting ended in chaos, with Karen storming out in a huff, but Marcus felt a surge of hope. Maybe, just maybe, things were starting to change. That night, as he sat on his porch, listening to the crickets and the distant hum of traffic, Marcus realized that he was no longer afraid. He had found allies, found his voice, and found the courage to fight for the community he wanted Willow Creek to be. The battle was far from over, but for the first time, Marcus felt like he was truly home. The weeks that followed marked a turning point in Willow Creek Estates, as Marcus and his growing coalition of neighbors began to chip away at the foundation of Karen's authority, exposing the cracks that had long been hidden beneath the surface of suburban civility. The next HOA meeting was packed, with more residents in attendance than anyone could remember, and the air was thick with anticipation. Karen, ever the picture of composure in her tailored suit and immaculate hair, tried to maintain control, but the mood had shifted. Marcus, now well-versed in the bylaws and city codes, asked for a full accounting of the HOA's finances, and when Karen hesitated, citing confidentiality, Mrs. Patel stood up and reminded everyone that transparency was not just a courtesy, but a legal requirement. The room buzzed with murmurs of agreement, and for the first time, Karen's veneer of authority seemed to falter. Over the next hour, residents took turns sharing their grievances. Mr. Lee recounted his flagpole ordeal. The Garcias described the threats over their children's playset, and the Gwynns detailed the absurdity of being fined for string lights during Diwali. Each story was met with nods and sympathetic murmurs, and as the list of complaints grew, Karen's responses became increasingly defensive. She insisted that she was only enforcing the rules, that her actions were for the good of the community, but it was clear that her grip was slipping. Marcus watched as the board members, once content to rubber stamp Karen's decisions, began to question her judgment, asking for documentation and second opinions. The meeting ended with a motion to form a committee to review the HOA's practices, and though Karen tried to stall, the vote passed overwhelmingly. In the days that followed, Marcus found himself at the center of a whirlwind of activity. He helped draft new guidelines for the committee, organize neighborhood gatherings to foster a sense of unity, and even set up a group chat where residents could share concerns and support one another. The atmosphere in Willow Creek began to change. Neighbors who had once kept to themselves now stopped to chat. Children played together in the cul-de-sacs, and the sense of isolation that had plagued Marcus since his arrival began to dissipate. Karen, meanwhile, grew increasingly isolated. Her emails became more strident, her violation notices more frequent, but fewer and fewer people took her seriously. The board, emboldened by the support of the community, began to push back, overturning fines and demanding explanations for her actions. One afternoon, as Marcus was tending to his garden, Karen marched up his driveway, her face flushed with anger. "You think you've won, don't you?" she spat, waving a stack of papers in his face. "You and your little group. This is my neighborhood. I built this community." Marcus met her gaze, calm and steady. "It's our neighborhood, Karen, and it's time everyone had a say." She glared at him, her hands trembling, then turned on her heel and stormed off. That evening, Marcus received a letter from the HOA board, informing him that the committee had found no basis for the majority of the fines Karen had issued, and that his record would be cleared. The letter also stated that the board would be reviewing Karen's conduct as president, with the possibility of a vote to remove her from her position. The news spread quickly, and the sense of relief was palpable. For the first time, residents felt empowered to speak up, to challenge the status quo, and to imagine a future where the HOA served the community rather than ruling over it. Marcus, who had once felt like an outsider, was now at the heart of a movement for change. He received thank-you notes, homemade cookies, and invitations to dinners from neighbors who had once been strangers. The garden he had planted flourished, a symbol of a new life taking root in Willow Creek. As summer turned to fall, the neighborhood came together for a block party, the first in years. There was music, laughter, and the smell of barbecue in the air. Children raced up and down the street, and adults mingled, sharing stories and dreams for the future. Marcus stood in the midst of it all, a smile on his face, grateful for the journey that had brought him here. He knew there would be more challenges ahead, more battles to fight, but for now, he allowed himself to savor the victory. The community had found its voice, and together they had reclaimed their home. The winds of change swept through Willow Creek Estates with a quiet but undeniable force, And as autumn deepened, the neighborhood's transformation became impossible to ignore. The committee's investigation into Karen's tenure as HOA president uncovered a pattern of selective enforcement, questionable fines, and a disregard for transparency that shocked even her former allies. At the next board meeting, the room was packed to the walls, the air electric with anticipation and a sense of justice long overdue. Karen, her confidence now brittle, tried to defend her actions, but the evidence was overwhelming. Emails in which she admitted to targeting certain families, financial records that showed fines being levied without due process, and testimony from residents who had been silenced or intimidated. The board, no longer under her sway, called for a vote of no confidence. The result was decisive. Karen was removed from her position, and a new president, Mrs. Patel, was elected by a landslide. The news was met with cheers and applause, and for the first time, Marcus saw genuine smiles on the faces of his neighbors, a weight lifted from the community's collective shoulders. In the weeks that followed, the HOA underwent a transformation. The new board prioritized transparency, holding open meetings and publishing minutes for all to see. Fines were reviewed and, in many cases, refunded. Residents were encouraged to participate in decision-making, and the sense of fear and suspicion that had once permeated the neighborhood was replaced by a spirit of cooperation and mutual respect. Marcus, who had once felt like an outsider, was now a trusted voice on the committee, helping to draft new guidelines that emphasized fairness and inclusivity. He found himself busier than ever, but the work was rewarding, and he took pride in knowing that it had helped spark the change. Karen, meanwhile, retreated from public life. Her house, once the epicenter of HOA activity, grew quiet. She was seen less and less, and eventually a for sale sign appeared on her lawn. When she finally moved out, there was no fanfare, no farewell party, just a quiet sense of closure. Life in Willow Creek settled into a new rhythm. The block parties became a regular event, and Marcus's garden flourished, a riot of color and life that drew compliments from passers-by. He grew close to his neighbors, sharing meals, stories, and laughter. The children who once played in the shadows now raced freely across the lawns, their laughter a testament to the neighborhood's renewal. Marcus often reflected on how far things had come since that first, frustrating encounter with Karen's Lexus in his driveway. He realized that the struggle had not just been about parking or fines, but about dignity, respect, and the right to belong. He had learned that standing up for oneself could be lonely and frightening, but that courage, when shared, could transform a community. One crisp evening, as the sun set in a blaze of orange and gold, Marcus sat on his porch, a mug of tea warming his hands, and watched as his neighbors gathered in the street for another impromptu celebration. Mrs. Patel waved from across the lawn, and the Garcias called out an invitation to join them for dessert. Marcus smiled, feeling a deep sense of contentment. He had come to Willow Creek in search of peace, but he had found something even more precious, a home, a community, and a place where he truly belonged. As the stars blinked to life overhead and the sounds of laughter drifted through the night, Marcus knew that the story of Willow Creek was far from over. There would be new challenges, new disagreements, and new opportunities to grow. But whatever the future held, he was ready, because he was no longer alone. He was part of something larger than himself, a tapestry of lives woven together by struggle, resilience, and hope. And as he looked out over the neighborhood he had helped to change, Marcus felt a quiet pride, knowing that he had not only claimed his driveway, but had helped reclaim the very heart of Willow Creek Estates.